All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to give folks a moment just to log on. All right. Well, welcome, everyone. My name is Gianna. I'm the head of reference here at the Chelmsford Public Library. Thanks for stopping by for another Art on Thursday this evening. Tonight, we have Rhythm and Hues, the Harlem Renaissance and its legacy. The Harlem Renaissance, a cultural explosion in the 1920s, saw African American artists challenge stereotypes and celebrate their heritage. From the poetic simplicity of Jacob Lawrence to the cosmopolitan portrait photographs of James Vandersea, this era produced works that continue to resonate today. Discover the visionaries who gave voice to the African American experience and forever changed the landscape of American culture. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our presenter, Jane from IamCulturallyCurious.com. We will leave questions for the end of the presentation, pop them into the chat or Q&A section of your Zoom menu down below. And we hope to have some great questions tonight. After you, Jane.
Thanks so much, Gianna. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day. This is February school vacation where I live. So this is a nice little break from all the kids' stuff. I can use my brain in a different way tonight. And I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to do that. This is one of the last times I get to give this presentation this month. And I'd like to think that it is like a finely polished stone. So you get it at its best. Here's hoping, right? So some of you might be familiar with the Harlem Renaissance. Some of you, this might be brand new. But to put it succinctly, art historians think of the Harlem Renaissance as this unprecedented flowering of cultural expression that happened primarily in the 1920s. And it's marked by these bold colors, by rhythmic patterns, and by this celebration of African American life and culture. And we'll talk about the ways that it was unprecedented along the course of the hour. But we get a little bit of a tease, a little bit of a tickler from this image that's on the screen, which we will also circle back to. Now, I feel like I must recognize too that I am an imperfect vessel for sharing this content. Who am I as a white woman to talk about issues of Black identity? I will say that I approach this with great humility, and I'm very much open to feedback and constructive criticism along the way. But I really love this period in the history of art. This is what I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on, my undergraduate thesis on. So it's an area that I thought I knew so well, and then going back to put this presentation together, I appreciated it in a whole new way. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this hour together tonight. Like I said, we'll circle back to this great image on the screen. We're going to get started with an introduction to the Harlem Renaissance. It's going to be a little bit longer than my typical introduction to anything because there's a lot of threads to this and it deserves our time. And initially, I thought we'd just zero in on a couple of artists, a handful of artists, but there are so many great ones and great works of art. Instead, I decided to switch it over to themes, and even that I had trouble narrowing down. So we're going to do people and portraits, history and heroes. And because our subject is rhythm and hues, we got to add a little bit of music and dance to that too. And then we'll wrap up with our conclusion. All right. So let's get started with our introduction to the Harlem Renaissance. Here we go. Uh, well, for our introduction, we're not going to dive right into the 1920s right away. We have a quick preamble here, and these are two images that were made in the 1940s. They're part of Jacob Lawrence's Great Migration series, and he did 60 panels on the movement, this diaspora of Black people who are living in the United States. So let me sort of zoom out for a moment. For about 100 years in this country, 90% of Black people lived in the South. And beginning in 1910, there was this great migration away from the South to northern cities. And that's really how we get the Harlem Renaissance, that all of these people were moving away from the South. Now, why were they moving away from the South in 1910? Slavery is over, but of course you have Jim Crow laws, you have widespread disenfranchisement when it comes to voting, a lack of civil rights, a lack of opportunity, widespread poverty, and a rising tide of political and racial violence in the South. So there's lynchings, there's race riots. It's simply an inhospitable place for Black people to live, right? So Jacob Lawrence's panels here that I have on the screen, I think help to crystallize a couple of big ideas here. And for each one of these panels, which are told in really, like it's a story that's told in an economy of details, but he adds like one line of text for each one of these. So the image on the left here, he describes the scene of this interior with a few people around the table with, in every Southern home, people met to decide whether or not to go north. Imagine what that conversation is like. Do you leave everyone you know, everything you've ever known, in search for a better future, in search for more freedom, more opportunity? And of course, as we know, these are conversations that have been going on globally with different disenfranchised groups ever since, and before this, of course, too. Now, over on the right, we have another image from this same series, from the same artist, Jacob Lawrence. And the way this is just a scene where we're looking at a train station with like this crush of people heading into these different portals labeled Chicago, New York, St. Louis. And this is a good reminder to all of us that when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, this is a cultural flowering that happens in Harlem. That's its epicenter. But essentially, Black people were moving north to all of these major cities. And there was a flowering of cultural expression everywhere across the North, and even to a certain degree to the Midwest, too. So we just think of Harlem as its epicenter. So these two images, I think, help to give us that little bit of a framework, a little bit of a frame of reference for understanding how this, how we wind up in Harlem. So these next two images here, let's see if I can advance my slides, okay? We are looking at a photograph of Harlem from 1924 here on the screen. We see all of these well-dressed individuals waiting in this long line here patiently. A few of them look like they're aware of the camera and are sort of smiling out at us. This is an image of people waiting to vote, and they seem very happy to do so. And I think most of us have probably had that experience too, of feeling like you're doing your civic duty, waiting in line to vote. And it's pretty remarkable to imagine that many of the people in this image are probably, recent transplants to Harlem, and they are relishing this, what is probably one of their first opportunities ever to to take part in democracy. Now, over on the right, just because some of us get to Manhattan more than others, I do have our map of New York City here. We've got Times Square with Central Park just above it. And you can see that the section of Harlem, that neighborhood is just above Central Park there. Some people might be thinking, why Harlem? Why did people congregate in Harlem? Well, there's a very simple financial answer to that. And that is there had been a housing crisis there, essentially. The neighborhood had been overbuilt early on in the 20th century, and there were still very strict laws about which races you could rent to there. So there was a crash there, and that just meant that it was suddenly cheap, and that was where recent transplants to New York City could move. And of course, you move to where people are moving, so it became a predominantly Black neighborhood very quickly. So we understand our timetable here, the 1920s roughly. We understand the where. Now, what about this term Renaissance, right? How do we understand this term Renaissance? And I want to actually bring up a poem from a preeminent Harlem Renaissance poet named Langston Hughes. He's going to help us understand Renaissance, right? And this is his poem, Harlem. Many of you have probably heard it before. It's short and sweet. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? That last line is so powerful. And when we think of the Harlem Renaissance, it is an explosion of artistic expression across a variety of media. And that's why we refer to it as a renaissance. And I think it reminds a lot of scholars of like the Italian Renaissance, where it's not just art, but it's philosophy, it's humanism, it's people who it's this sudden flowering of all of these disciplines at the same time. And so what we see on the screen here, it's a little bit overwhelming, but we have examples of great writers, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston over here, great musicians, Bessie Smith, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and then great artists all at the same time. This is William H. Johnson at the center of the screen here with this very stylish couple sitting at a cafe table, well dressed. They've got their bottle of wine on the table. And we see a little bit of this rhythm and hues happening in this picture. We've got the striping of the floorboards here. We've got the pattern of his plaid suit. And then we've got these bold pops of color, from her lips to the red gloves that she's wearing to these little decorations on her shoes. So we've got a little bit of rhythm and hues here already. But I bring in this image to well, I guess to remind us that there was no one single mode of cultural expression when it comes to the Harlem Renaissance. There's no singular style that defines it. So we'll talk a little bit about what these styles look like. I think I want to circle back to the idea of the timeline a little bit too. So Great Migration starts around 1910, and the first Great Migration is generally 1910 to 1940. Art historians basically give us like the 19 teens to like mid 1930s for the Harlem Renaissance. Tonight's program is called The Harlem Renaissance and Its Legacy, because many of these artists were working well into the 40s, the 50s, and beyond. And there are certainly like next generation artists too. So we'll be seeing some of the central artists from the Harlem Renaissance, and as well as the work that they were doing in the decades following. So like I said, there's no one single mode of cultural expression here and no one singular style, but I want to share with you a couple of influential writers who helped to shape some of the modes of expression. And the first one is W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote this book here, The Souls of Black Folk. This is a photograph of this preeminent philosopher, really, from the turn of the century. He was one of the founders of the NAACP. And this was his 1903 text that was influential in a number of ways, but I want to zero in on how it impacted Black cultural expression. Because what Du Bois was basically arguing was that African Americans are not starting from zero here at the turn of the century. It's not as though there's no cultural history to reach back from and to learn from or to build off of. So he cites, modes of artistic expression that existed during the time of slavery and even further back. And so what we'll see is that there's a lot of artists, particularly in the 1920s, that are kind of using that advice from Du Bois to shape how they are painting their present day. So I have a work here on the right. It's done by an artist named Aaron Douglas. And you can see here that he's kind of calling up modes of expression that remind me of, say, ancient Egyptian art, particularly with this silhouetted figure here, whose legs we can see in profile, whose torso is frontal. This is like the iconic way that bodies were portrayed in ancient Egyptian art. And we can see some stylized elements here, something that sort of looks like a mask or maybe a shield, and certainly some suggestions of pyramids at the bottom left. And then there are like zigzags and sort of wavy rays from the sun that certainly tie into Art Deco and everything else that's happening in the art world at that time. So you can imagine many of these artists are kind of fusing these different styles and influences together. But here is Aaron Douglas in particular, reaching all the way back to African art and using it as a mode of expression in a work that he called Rebirth. So he is very consciously thinking about this is a rebirth, a renaissance for Black modes of expression and African modes of expression. Now, this approach to art making is generally referred to as Afrocentrism, and there are some incredible examples of this. These are two examples by women artists from the 1920s, Black women artists. And it's just, I think you might be amazed tonight to see how many Black women artists were working. As professional artists. So we have on the left an example of a sculpture by a woman named Meta Box Warwick Fuller. And this is her sculpture from 1921 called Ethiopia Awakening. And with this little sculpture, I should mention too that Fuller was like had this incredible academic training. She went to France and studied with the sculptor Rodin, and we can see her here again, sort of calling on African artistic modes of expression with a figure that kind of is reminiscent of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh or mummy. We can see like this wrapped body at the lower half of her body. But then it's as though she's become unbound or freed from bondage, and her arms are loose. One hand is over her heart, and her head twists to the side. Her neck is turned, and it's as though she's looking towards her future with her heart leading her. So it's this sense of the past and the future all wound into this one figure in such an expressive way. On the right, we have an example of a painting from a woman named Lois Mailou Jones, and this is her painting called this one is called The Ascent of Ethiopia from 1932. This is at the Milwaukee Art Museum. So again, this is an image that is dominated by these African motifs, namely Egyptian motifs, with this pharaoh-like figure that we see in profile in the foreground. Just beyond the pharaoh are these Black silhouetted figures that are kind of progressing away up these staircases, sort of away from the pyramids and towards a modern day city where we can see drama, arts, and music all thriving. It's as though, you go directly from Africa up the hill to Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance. So we can see in both of these works that example of Afrocentrism and Du Bois's idea of reaching back to, essentially your cultural ancestry in order to make art that resonates today. All of this is happening sort of conveniently on the heels of a major movement in modernism at the time, and that was Cubism, of course, and Picasso and Brock fragmenting spaces and collapsing spaces and reducing their color palettes down. So I have an example of a Picasso Cubist painting from 1907, where most of us are probably familiar with the fact that Picasso had been very carefully looking at African masks. That's what inspired his stylization of the form and ultimately his experiments that led to Cubism. And I think with this figure here, you can see with like the shading here and the cross hatching, there's literally this fine line between traditional modes of light and shadow and showing the stylization of an African mask. We have this long attenuated face with these big almond-shaped eyes, and these are elements of African masks that certainly inspired his work, and we'll see several Black artists that were working in the 1920s. We have this awesome self-portrait by an artist over here on the right. His name is Malvin Gray Johnson. He painted this self-portrait in 1934. And look at how he's also reduced his color palette down to like, these beiges and the blacks and the grays and the browns. And he's also sort of aligned himself with images that to me look like African masks in a framed picture in the background here. So he is asserting his sense of self, certainly, but he's aligning it with this African past in this particular self-portrait here, which is just so stunning. continuing on and continuing to think about Afrocentrism in art during this time, we have two examples of sculptures of masks from an artist named Sargent Johnson over here on the left. And the one on the far left gives us, again, that sense of an artist who's looking very closely at African masks in the same way that Picasso had been doing in the first few years of the 20th century. So we have a mask here that's very stylized in terms of the anatomy of a human face, right? It's long, it's attenuated, it's got these ridges on it that continue down the nose. The eyes are set very far apart, and there's like this this patterning across the top with this stylized hair. Now, alongside that, I have another example from the same sculptor. These are both copper masks, I believe. And this one over here, that's our center image, this was a mask that Sargent Johnson did not to call back these traditions in African art, but instead to make a figure that he thought sort of represented the modern day African American. So we can see that he's working more closely to, or working more carefully to try and capture the physiognomy of an African American in terms of the fullness of the lips here or the size of the nose. But I still see a little bit of stylization here, particularly in the way that he's describing perhaps something like the brows. There's a strict symmetry and a frontality to this piece too that also kind of reminds me a little bit of ancient Egyptian sculpture. So even though it's a mask, there is something sort of still and eternal about it. And I think you can see something similar here in the image that I have over here on the right. Now, this is a photograph of a sculpture of Booker T. Washington, and the artist who created this sculpture is named Selma Burke. This is her in the photograph here. She her portrait bust here of Booker T. Washington, the famous educator, I think has a little bit of what we saw in Sargent Johnson's mask here. That strict frontality to it, the symmetry, the stylization maybe around the brows and the sense of like an eternal gaze. Now you might be thinking, I've never heard of the artist Selma Burke before. And here she is creating this important sculptural bust. Well, are you ready for a mind-blowing fact? You actually own a work of art by Selma Burke. Yes, you. You can't really cash it in though, because here's the story behind it. Selma Burke actually created this beautiful relief portrait sculpture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I believe this was in the 1930s that she did this. She actually reached out to the White House and requested a session with the President of the United States so that she could sketch him from life. And she was granted 45 minutes, and she went to the White House with a brown paper bag and sketched the president from life, and then created this portrait relief of him. Now, ultimately, his portrait relief wound up on a US dime, a 10-cent coin, right? But the image that's on our dime is very similar, just a little bit different. And so Selma Burke, our artist here, felt like the artist that was getting credit for that relief had kind of ripped her off. So she actually asked for an investigation into, the whole affair, who should be credited with this work essentially. And unfortunately, the FBI ended up investigating her. And so we'll hear a couple of pretty unfortunate stories like that include a fair amount of injustice along the way. So that's the story of Selma Burke. If you want to know more about the story of the dime, there's a great article online on Atlas Obscura about who designed the American dime, and you can learn more about her. So there's one other major thinker from the Harlem Renaissance whose writing and thinking really influenced art. And I wanted to introduce you to him. His name is Alain Locke, and we can see a photograph of him here on the right, along with an anthology that he edited from 1925 called The New Negro. Interestingly, the Harlem Renaissance as a movement was called the New Negro movement as it was happening. Nobody was like, uh, bumping into their neighbor and saying, how about this Renaissance we're living in? It was called the New Negro Movement. And over here in this image of a parade in Harlem from the 1920s, you can maybe just make out the sign in the car that says, the new Negro has no fear. What an idea, right? To move from the South, where you are probably living in fear all the time, to a northern city where you can live in a like-minded community and not be afraid every day. It's pretty powerful. Now back to Locke and back to his book, The New Negro. He was publishing short stories and poems and that sort of thing, but essentially putting forward this idea, this new idea of who African Americans were or could be in the 1920s. And he established that the new Negro was educated, culturally aware, politically conscious, and really breaking free from the stereotypes that existed around African Americans dating back to the 19th century and back to slavery. So, breaking free from all of that. So, what does the new Negro look like? Very often, these are the images that come up, or at least this photograph over here on the left. This is a photograph by a preeminent photographer of the time. His name is James Vanderzee. This is a 1932 image simply called Couple Harlem. I should mention James Vanderzee ran a very successful portrait studio in Harlem during the 1920s. It was sort of like a community hub. He's considered the eyes of the Harlem Renaissance. And here we have this very stylish young couple wearing these giant fur coats, stepping out of their very shiny Cadillac here on the streets of Harlem. And we can see success. We can see their elegance. We can see that these are cosmopolitan figures we're looking at. And this simply did not exist in America really prior to this moment in history. And here's James Vanderzee capturing this in such a wonderful way. Now, over on the right, we have this gorgeous image. There was a recent exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art about the Harlem Renaissance. And this beautiful young girl in the pink dress, I think, sort of captured a lot of hearts and minds. She kind of became Instagram famous. This is done by another woman artist, maybe someone you haven't heard of before. Her name is Laura Wheeler Waring. And this is simply called Girl in a Pink Dress from 1927. But there is something about this young woman's beauty, her elegance, this upright posture, her short jazz age bob here, the dress with the drop waist. It all kind of comes together to spell out, again, another image of an elegant Black figure, the likes of which were not being created prior to this moment in history. And, let's just back up for a second. This is a moment that's only 100 years old. So it's pretty remarkable. And it is worth celebrating, right? So to circle back to James Vanderzee as a photographer for just a moment, like I said, he owned a portrait studio, and most of his portraits are fairly straightforward, usually involves like a standing figure, a couple of props, very much in presenting elegant figures. And there's like a famous quote about how he always tried to make his subjects look better in the photograph than they did in real life. But these two particular group portraits really spoke to me because, of course, in both of them, we can see his subjects are reading. And let's just focus on how important and extraordinary that was. Because certainly during the time of slavery in most slave states, most most enslaved Black people were not allowed. It was illegal for them to learn to read and write. And so here we are, just a generation, maybe two, removed from slavery. So, of course, in order to show just how sophisticated you are, your literacy is tied into this. And the artist here, James Vanderzee, does such a good job creating these kind of relaxed, somehow I always think of like John Singer Sargent, like these informal kind of casual poses of families congregating around the written word here, and they're beautiful. So I'm going to tie another James Vanderzee photograph here to a work of art. We have his portrait of this sort of high society tea in Harlem from 1927 over here on the right. And I'm connecting it to a painting by Archibald Motley. We'll be seeing plenty of him tonight. And this is a work from the previous year simply called Cocktails. So this is a group of ladies who are having forbidden drinks during Prohibition. This is a little bit more of a high society function over here. But in both cases, we see well-dressed African American women socializing with each other in kind of in physical spaces that they would not have had access to really in generations prior. And here they every one of them looks exquisite and these look like social circles that any one of us would want to be a part of. So circling back to the new Negro, breaking free from older stereotypes, we have one more Archibald Motley image that I'd like to share with you to underscore what the new Negro looked like. This is a 1934 painting called Barbecue. This is our title slide tonight. It's just such a fun, festive image. Now, normally when I think of barbecue, I think of like very messy fingers and like I should say picnic tables, something really informal. And this certainly has the barbecue, but it's upscale. It's white tablecloths. It is waiters in tuxedos. And Archibald Motley does all of these wonderful things to move our eyes around the composition, from the twinkling lights here as the sun is setting, to the waiters themselves and these activated poses that they have, to these bold patches of color in the women's dresses, like and the men's hats. The yellows can just kind of move you around here, as can the reds and the blues and the greens. And everybody seems to be on a date here or running into friends. It seems like the kind of space, again, any one of us would want to spend an evening. Again, this is the shaping of the new Negro breaking free from any sort of those past stereotypes. So we round out this very long introduction to the Harlem Renaissance with two images that I just love so much I could not leave out of tonight's program. So on the left, we have Jacob Lawrence's picture called The Pool Parlor. And this was actually his first image to ever enter into the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's from 1942. And maybe just in looking at it, you love it as much as I do. But it is like, it's just kind of like filled with this wild patterns, from the pool cues to these hanging light fixtures to the angles of the pool tables themselves. And then you have those bold pops of color in the billiard balls and some of the clothes. The little detail that I love so much are the cigarettes hanging off the edges of the pool tables with that little zigzag of smoke, which again reminds us how our eye kind of moves like those pool balls all throughout this composition. He like manipulates our eyeballs in a masterful way. Over here on the right is another great work. This is by a Boston-based artist named Alan Rohan Kright, and it's called Schools Out. I believe this is also from 1942, if I'm remembering correctly. So what we are seeing here, oh wait, sorry, this is 1936. This is at the Smithsonian. We are seeing a girls' school that's ending for the day, and we just see like a sea of these yellow and white dresses, and they're well-dressed mothers who are on the sidewalk there to meet them. We get this wonderful sense of community. We have that wonderful sense of like rhythm and hues that are moving our eyes throughout the composition. And I think in this picture, you see what is so typical during this time in Black expression, and it's two ideas. It's the sense of community and it's the sense of aspiration. This idea that that life is good and it's only going to get better, but by how we're living our lives, how we're investing in ourselves and our community. So that wonderful sense of aspiration and community will sort of guide us through today's program. That being said, we're going to drill down away from community just for a moment. We're going to look at the individual because we are turning our attention to people and portraits now. And this slide here is maybe my favorite slide of the whole program. We are looking at three self-portraits by Black artists from the Harlem Renaissance, although these kind of spread a bigger span of time. This is Archibald Motley's self portrait from 1925, William H. Johnson's self portrait from 1937, and Lois Mailou Jones from 1941. And I want to take a moment to just acknowledge how remarkable it is that we are looking at images of professional artists, Black artists, because really prior to this moment in history, I can think of less than five professional Black artists that existed in America. Um, and here we have three of them who are not just working, but asserting their identities as artists out into the world with these self portraits. And the way they're looking out at us, I almost get the sense they understand the importance of the moment. This is only 100 years ago, and images like this simply didn't exist before this moment. It's remarkable, isn't it? So each one of these artists kind of clutching their paintbrush seems to know just how important it is that who they are as a Black individual in the United States, making their way as an artist, is just so remarkable in this moment. So as we turn, and we could talk a lot about these images. I love William H. Johnson's self-portrait here. It's so Van Gogh, isn't it? With these big bold brushstrokes, the way he's kind of pinching that paintbrush. I love Archibald Motley's realism here, and these little squiggly lines that remind me of just how precise his little mustache is. I mean, these are all great, but we're going to turn our attention to a slightly different kind of self-portrait. This is a self-portrait called The Janitor Who Paints from 1937, done by the artist Palmer Hayden. And so it's a little bit later. And Palmer Hayden, even later on, sort of talks about how this painting to him was a little bit of a protest picture, which is unusual for this time period because I think, like I said, most images from this period are about community and aspiration. But Palmer Hayden, we can see him here with his little artist beret on and his palette, his brushes, and his painter's easel, the subjects that he's painting here. Well, he had to work two jobs. Even though we're looking at professional artists, not all of them could make ends meet just by painting. A lot of these artists had to have rent parties, invite all of their friends over to help raise money just to make rent. And Palmer Hayden had to work as a janitor. So we can see some of the tools of his trade here, a really nice kind of formal elements of the cat kind of echoing the shape of this trash can here, and the broom and the dust mop, suggesting that other facet of his life. And when he talked about this as a protest, one of the things that he disliked was that if you were a janitor, that's who you were. Nobody thought of you as the artist, right? If you worked as a janitor, that's how people thought of you. So that's his little bit of a protest here. All right. So continuing on with this idea of portraiture, I want to introduce you to the artist Augusta Savage, another Black woman artist who's working in the 1920s. And again, working as a sculptor. This is probably one of her best known works. It's called Gammon from 1929. And we are looking at a portrait bust of a young Black boy. It's remarkable in so many ways because when I say portrait bust, this is a classical form, a form of just the head and the neck and maybe a little bit of the chest. This dates back to classical antiquity. This was the way you would depict an ancient Roman emperor, right? And so she's using that same traditional form to describe this little boy. And the title here, Gammon, is a French term that essentially refers to like a street urchin or a homeless child. So this is a little boy who's on the margins of society. And she's created this really interesting kind of dynamic sculpture of him too. Think of the masks that we saw before that were strictly frontal and symmetrical. He's kind of tilting his head, looking off to the side. He's intriguing just to look at, isn't he? But just the idea that she's taken this form to focus in on somebody who is on the margins of society is so extraordinary, isn't it? And it is a beautifully rendered sculpture in so many ways. So much so that I'd like to show you just a couple of other perspectives of it. I love the shape of his jaw from this angle, and then from the other side, look at that skeptical expression on his face. Doesn't he just seem like a real kid here? She's just captured something so amazing. But Augusta Savage, working as a Black artist in the 1920s, could not always afford to cast her sculptures in bronze, which was an expensive material. So she would oftentimes work in plaster and then paint the plaster to look like bronze. I think that's what we're looking at here. Some of her works were later cast in bronze, but of course, if it's a plaster sculpture, it means it's much more vulnerable, it's much more easily damaged or destroyed, and that's like a little bit of a sign of what we'll see later on, but an extraordinary work, of course, nonetheless. Now, as we're continuing on with portraiture and sculpture, I've got a portraiture in people. I've got this other portrait by Archibald Motley for us to consider. It's from 1925. It's another lovely portrait of a lovely young woman, sort of like the girl in the pink dress that we saw before, but this one has a little bit more context. This is a lovely woman in a well-appointed interior. She's got this fabulous coat on, right, with the big red shawl collar here, the little hat that draws our attention to her eyes. Art historians love to make a very big deal about the fact that she's holding gloves here, which would signify to many that she's got a sense of agency. But Archibald Motley called this work the Octoroon Girl. And octoroon and quadroon are terms that date back to slavery and essentially reference how much Black blood you have as an individual. Octoroon would essentially mean that, like, 1/8. So the idea that like one of your grandparents or great grandparents is Black, and that defines who you are as a person. So, of course, using this kind of outdated term here is a criticism of that term. But what we'll see too is that this artist, Archibald Motley, is particularly interested in skin tones and that sort of thing. He himself was biracial. So this is kind of a particular interest of him. But a gorgeous portrait, nonetheless, that sort of pokes at that history just a little bit. The last portrait that I'd like to share with you also comes to us from Alan Rohan Crite, the Boston-based artist that I mentioned before. This is called Harriet and Leon, and it was painted in 1941. This is in Boston at the Boston Athenaeum. Sebastian Smee, who's the Pulitzer Prize-winning art historian, wrote a lovely little piece about this in the Washington Post, just describing the wonderful sense of character that Crite gives these two figures. You really get the sense that he studied their likeness and does such a good job portraying it in paint here. I always get the sense that their bodies are a little bit undersized for their heads, but the way he's carefully rendered their faces kind of makes up for that or adds to the charm. I don't know. You get a great sense of who they are, just kind of seriously, somberly walking through the streets of Boston. Are they heading to church? Are they heading to work? I don't know, but they are progressing along their way. Sebastian Smee makes a good case for how the world seems to bend around them, pointing to this curious child here who's kind of like leaning in the direction that they're walking. Even the figure back here who's delivering ice is kind of moving in that direction, as is the child pulling the kid on the sled here. So you have this sense of the impact, really, the ripple that they have in the world that they are occupying. And as everyday people just kind of moving forward here, Harriet and Leon certainly seem worthy of our gazes and our respect. So we turn our attention now to history and heroes. Again, a remarkable moment in the history of art, in African American history, and in American history, because now we have like a class of professional Black artists that live in America for the first time. And for the first time ever, they get to create images of their own history. Again, like reading, writing was outlawed. This is like the first time history is being documented this way. And so it's fascinating to me to see how how they describe it. And we have another work here from Aaron Douglas This one is called Into Bondage. This is at the National Gallery of Art in DC. This is from 1936. And we have these subtle gradations of tone. We have Aaron Douglas still sort of using the silhouette to describe sort of like more universal experiences as a term, as opposed to very specific individual experiences. He tends to use kind of like these figures that have like a little slit for eyes, but again, kind of that frontal torso and sometimes the feet in profile. We get the sense that this image through all of these, leaves and palm fronds, that we are in Africa here, that we see figures that have been captured into slavery. We see shackles on wrists as these figures are moving down towards the water where these tilting ships are coming towards us. Notice how Aaron Douglas fragments the space. He creates this target here that sort of subtly brings our eye towards that horizon line where everybody is focused on, where everybody's heading. He also creates this beam of light from the star, sort of reminding us of like otherworldly things, sort of grander things at the same time. So a little bit of that Art Deco, a little bit of modernism, and a little bit of that Afrocentrism to create this very powerful narrative here, very moving narrative, without a seeming sense of criticism beyond what he's showing here. He's not offering up a criticism of white culture. He's giving us a sense of what Into Bondage looked like from sort of the African American perspective. Now, as subtle as I think this is, the next work is not. What we're looking at here is sort of an action scene, right? And this is a work by the artist Hale Woodruff. He had studied fresco painting in Mexico with none other than Diego Rivera, the world-renowned Mexican muralist. And when he came back to America, he wanted to create, grand images that told the history of African Americans. He wanted heroes, he wanted narratives. And there weren't a lot of opportunities to do that in the 1930s. There was the WPA, but they weren't really particularly focused on African American history. So he finds an opportunity to do this at Talladega College in Alabama. And he does this whole series on the Amistad Mutiny. And since then, these murals have been removed from the walls of the college. They've been restored and have gone on like multi-city tours. This is by far the most dynamic of the images that are part of that series. And this is the actual mutiny on board the ship, where we can see African figures that have been captured into slavery rising up against the white figures who have captured them, who are transporting them to the new world here. And so they're the heroes. I mean, they have these sugarcane knives, but they are overtaking people that have actual firearms with them. They are, like I said, heroic. They are powerful. When has an image like this ever been created in the history of America? Again, prior to this moment, where the brown skinned figures are the heroes, where they are where they are seizing this moment and taking control of their own destinies. So it's a really powerful scene here, and again, probably could not have been created before this moment in history. Now, many African American artists who were working during the Harlem Renaissance were interested in creating scenes not just of African American history, but of celebrating African American heroes. Harriet Tubman is always a favorite among them. So we've seen several Aaron Douglas images already. This is his depiction of Harriet Tubman, sort of a symbolic scene where we see her in profile, or in silhouette, I should say, as we see with so many of his figures. She's standing at the top of this hill and symbolically breaking the chains above her, references to slavery on one side and freedom, and maybe even like the skyscrapers of New York City and Harlem over here on the right. At the center, we have William H. Johnson's depiction of Harriet Tubman as a static figure, almost like a formal portrait, right? But in this modernist vein of painting with a portrait bust of Harriet Tubman as an older lady down here on the right. There's no representation of the brutalities of slavery here, but we do see this suggestion of like the division of the North and the South between these two landscapes here. I do think it's kind of interesting that there is this little purple railroad track that's like running its way along the bottom third here. I'm fairly confident that William H. Johnson knew that the Underground Railroad was not a railroad, but he adds a little bit of that rhythm, right, to move our eyes around here. And of course, he adds the striped skirt and the blue coat here to remind us of the American flag. So we go from symbolic and static to dynamic. And this is Jacob Lawrence's depiction of Harriet Tubman as part of a series that he did on Tubman later on in his career. I think this is from 1967. This particular image in the series is called Forward. We can see that Harriet Tubman is lunging forward. She's got a firearm in her hand and she is pushing a man who is like seemingly paralyzed with fear. She is keeping everyone moving, and there's a group of figures behind her who are also following her. So variety of different of ways to show this one particular figure and how to represent what she really means to African American history, right? Another major figure that was represented quite a bit during this time was John Browne. And John Browne, if you're not familiar with the story, was a white man who tried to lead a slave revolt and so he became sort of like a folk legend. He, with several other men, almost like 24 men, decided to raid an armory called Harper's Ferry, and they thought if they got the guns and they armed the slaves, then the slaves would rise up and end slavery. So what we see over here and surprise, surprise, they were not successful. Spoiler alert, right? And they were arrested and tried for treason and ultimately sentenced to death. So what we have here on the left is an image of John Browne's trial. This is done by the artist Horace Pippin. You can see the date here, 1942. Horace Pippin is sort of like a folk artist, and he always said that he wouldn't paint really anything that he couldn't see. But he did want to paint this story from history because his grandmother had apparently seen John Browne's trial and had described it to him. So we can see John Browne on a stretcher here with a wound on his head, sort of recalling like Christ with the crown of thorns. We can see the members of the jury here, all white, but bearded men. And again, other associations with like religious images and Christ and the disciples and that sort of thing. Over here on the right, we have another image by William H. Johnson. And you can see John Browne as a stylized figure at the center. He's got this kind of yellow beard and yellow hair that looks very much like a halo. And according to legend, as he's descending the courthouse steps after being sentenced to death, an enslaved woman held up her child and he kissed John Browne on the way to the gallows. So that's what's being represented here, as well as portraits of all of his fellow co-conspirators who were sentenced to death for the raid on Harper's Ferry. So really profound and moving images here. We're going to round out our look at history and heroes with just a few more images of Jacob Lawrence's Great Migration series. And I did want to focus on this a little bit more because, again, I think the story of the Great Migration is, of course, a story that is evergreen. He was doing these images in 1941 and think of what was happening in Europe in 1941 and the displacement of people there. So this is the third image in the series. And like I said, he had the short little description for every panel. This one says, from every southern town, migrants left by the hundreds to travel north. And again, it just gets you thinking, what would it feel like to see people in your town just moving, just leaving, just making their way north? What would it feel like to stay? And so he's created this pyramid of moving figures. I think there's about a dozen of them there. And he's described them with just a few colors, some browns, peaches, yellows, greens. Again, sort of like Aaron Douglas, he's not giving us individualized faces, really. Again, this is more about speaking to a universal rather than a specific. And heads are bowed. People just have whatever they can carry over their shoulder or in their hands. We get the sense of determination, of that sense of movement, and also the hardship that goes along with it. And then we just have those six blackbirds in the background that are sort of accompanying them on this journey and also underscoring that movement there too. It's just remarkable in its simplicity and its effectiveness. Now, Jacob Lawrence describes some of the hardships of the Great Migration, in particular, the harassment that Black people faced as they were trying to leave the South. And he gives it to us in these two images here. On the left, he describes this work with railroad stations were at times so crowded with people leaving that special guards had to be called in to keep order. And notice how he sets those guards apart in the foreground. As white individuals, they do have facial features as opposed to everybody else here. And they're also armed and looking particularly brutish, right? Over here on the right, he says to make it difficult for the migrants to leave, they were arrested en masse. They often missed their train. So we can see this large figure standing in the doorway to the train here with figures beyond him with kind of heads bowed, certainly not looking for trouble, right? So again, I think there's just something that really resonates with today in images like this and focusing on these particular hardships that Jacob Lawrence so eloquently described way back in 1941. At the heart of it is that aspiration that I mentioned earlier, that dream of a better life that is suggested in so many of the works from this era. So now we're going to turn our attention to something a little lighter, to music and dance. And I don't know if you're like me, but when I think of the Harlem Renaissance, there's actually a little soundtrack in my head. It's not much of a soundtrack. It's just blaring trumpets. It's like Harlem Renaissance. And I think of like divas like this. I think of brass bands, and I think of people just tearing up the dance floor at the Cotton Club or at the Savoy. And it's because of photographs like these, right? But it's also because of the incredible images, the paintings that were created right along the way. So this is another painting by Archibald Motley. We've seen a few of his works tonight. This is his 1929 work called The Blues. This is at the Chicago History Museum. And in this work, we see all of these well-dressed dancers, again, because Archibald Motley, and this is a particular focus of his, varying skin tones here. He actually painted this in Paris, not in Chicago, because there were looser laws, fewer restrictions, I should say, about blacks and whites intermingling, basically. But in this scene, we've got the band down here in on the left foreground. We can see their instruments kind of jutting out into the dance floor. We see the dancers with their bodies and their faces kind of pressed together. And we get this great sense of the club, its vitality, the great sounds coming out of it. You can practically hear the horns as you look at this image. And you just, I mean, it looks fun, right? There's all these people smiling. That sense of fun sort of continues on. The band sort of stays in the same place for this next image here. This is another Palmer Hayden image. This is from 1943. And interestingly enough, this is another scene that is not set in Harlem. This one's called Beale Street Blues. So we're in Memphis right now. But we've got our brass band, two saxophone players, maybe that's a trumpet player. We've got our dancers at the center here. We've got a bar. We've got people playing games of chance, an elegantly dressed man here and in the foreground on the right. But there's something else that's happening in this particular composition. It's almost like this nightclub kind of opens up onto Beale Street. We can even see the riverboats in the background. And it's almost as though those negative stereotypes of the 19th century are like walking into this nightclub and kind of confronting these sophisticated figures from the 20th century. So I always think when I look at this that maybe Palmer Hayden had gone like south of the Mason-Dixon line and was kind of confronted with what life in the South looked like for African Americans and sort of paints that confrontation here. This is a strange and so kind of troubling image to spend some time with. But continuing on with the joyful part of it, the dancing, right? The music, let's stay with that because now we're going to look at William H. Johnson's Jitterbugs. And these images are just like so fun and frenetic. Every time I look at them, I just want to like start moving my own feet. So he painted these images in the 1940s. He did a whole series on them. And the term jitterbug basically refers to a few different kinds of dance, like the Charleston and the shag and the Big Apple. And all of this would have been, danced out on the floor to the sounds of syncopated Southern jazz. So we get the suggestion of the music with these unmanned instruments in the background. But the frenetic movement is certainly suggested through these dramatic poses, especially of the women in these yellow dresses in both of the images. They're like falling into their dance partners in both of these, but there's still this like unbridled sense of joy here, right? We get our sense of the rhythm and hues with the patterning of the jacket, with these pops of color. And then as he simplifies these figures over time too, we sort of get the sense that they're like jigsaw puzzle pieces that kind of fit together here. So it's like the music's getting faster, the feet are moving like more furiously, and it all kind of builds up to the crescendo of this picture, again, by Archibald Motley. This one is called Hot Rhythm. It's a later work, it's 1961. And now we're at this nightclub where the band is front and center. They're kind of framed by these costume dancers wearing these green costumes. The members of the band are sort of individualized here to a certain extent, and certainly we're supposed to sort of gravitate towards this trumpet player who's looking out at us. But as we go further back, these female figures are sort of like copy and paste, and then the club itself is this very flattened, compressed space. Again, we get all the sense of this energy and vitality, the movement of the dancers, the sound of those horns. It gives you such a great sense of what it would feel like to be in this club, right? Now we're going to take things down just a moment, and we are wrapping up. I promise you. I've got one more artist to share with you. We're going back to Augusta Savage to round out the evening, and she did a work that is focused on music, and I think it's sort of the perfect way to wrap up tonight. She was invited to create a work of public sculpture for the 1939 World's Fair, and she created this a 16-foot tall sculpture which she called Lift Every Voice and Sing, which at the time was a song that was thought of as the Negro national anthem. What a profound thing for a black sculptor to do, right? So she has created these 12 individualized faces with these stylized bodies, long attenuated robes that sort of look like the strings of a harp, right? And the soundboard of the harp sort of looks like this giant hand, maybe the hand of God, maybe it's like he's got the whole world in his hand. And then we have this other figure, this male figure who's holding the lyrics to the song in his hand. So this was a really popular sculpture at the World's Fair. Small replicas, metal replicas were made of it. This is Augusta Savage giving one of those metal replicas to the head of the World's Fair that year. Lots of postcards were sold of this work. And even though Augusta Savage called it Lift Every Voice and Sing, the fair referred to it simply as the harp. They renamed her work and certainly kind of took away some aspect of Black identity there. Here we can see Augusta Savage with the work in process. I think this gives us an awesome sense of the scale of this work too. It's one thing to hear it's 16 feet tall, and then you see it like this. Now, when with this work on public view in such a with so much foot traffic, she had hoped that somebody would come forward and sponsor it so that it could be cast in bronze. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So, like many of the temporary structures and other temporary works of art at the fair, this sculpture was bulldozed, just flattened at the end of the World's Fair. You might be thinking, I've seen it since then. There were some replicas made, and even some replicas that were eventually cast in bronze too. But it says quite a bit about how we value the work of African American women, even into the 20th century, that this work could just simply be destroyed. So we will wrap up On a more positive note, just a very quick conclusion here. I hope tonight's program gave you a nice sense of an introduction to the cultural blossoming that was the Harlem Renaissance, when Black artists, for the first time in our country's history, had the agency to celebrate their history and define their modern identities. I hope you found these works as inspirational as I did. I thought these two works of people in green moving forward, heading in the same direction were just a nice way to wrap things up. I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have. I'm going to start with the Q&A. I do see a lot in the chat here, and I'll do my best to try and answer everything. Thank you, everybody, for your time and attention. I really appreciate you spending this hour with me. All right, let's take a look at what's in the Q&A. Somebody says, I'm just curious why you determined the long line of people were in line to vote. I'm currently reading Harlem Rhapsody by V.C. Murray. She talks about how people were coming up in droves and real estate was at a premium. So as soon as I saw the picture in front of the real estate office, I said, they're standing in line for apartments. Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I found the work online and it was captioned as waiting in line for voting, but I did notice that it was a real estate office and I thought that that was unusual. You might be onto something. I'm so glad you shared that. I will go back and research that image a little bit more because now I'm wondering if what you've shared here is maybe the real truth behind that image. I appreciate you sharing that. Joe, thanks for your question. You can be in touch with me if you need the names of the artists. Lisa says, could you please repeat the name of the artist and the painting for the pale pastel piece with the concentric circles that look like a target? Yes, that artist was Aaron Douglas, and the work was called Into Bondage. It's from 1936, and that's at the National Gallery of Art. Many of the artists that we saw tonight, their work is at the National Gallery of Art or the Smithsonian. Somebody said, where is Selma's portrait sculpture of Roosevelt? Would that be called a relief? Yes, Selma Burke, B-U-R-K-E. I think there's an E. I'm not sure where it resides today. Start with that Atlas Obscura article. That might be the best place to look. It was really hard to kind of track down the specifics. It's really interesting too. It's hard to kind of track down, especially online, just images of her work without her in it. It seems like her identity is like bound into these works. Okay, thank you for those questions. Thank you again to the anonymous person that mentioned that real estate office. Thank you so much for the kind words that I'm seeing in the chat. I'm just going back here. Let's see. Oh, people are calling out like local connections here. This is wonderful. Oh, somebody says the singer in the photo was Billie Holiday. Wow. Okay. A lot of the images that I found for tonight's program were apparently miscaptioned. I thought that was Bessie Smith. Is that what I said? Thank you for correcting me on that. I will make a note of it. You are a very savvy bunch because I have given this program a number of times this month and nobody's called that out. Thank you for correcting me. I will fix that. Billie Holiday. Okay. And so great local connections too. People are calling out to artists that were born in the Boston area. Johnson was born in Boston. Alan Rohan Crite, also from lived in Boston. And wow, Ivy says my husband was a friend of James Vanderzee, was a pallbearer at his funeral. Oh my goodness, that's astonishing. And you're still friends with his widow, who was 60 years younger than him. Wow, incredible. His photographs are absolutely remarkable. It's great to hear about those connections. And people are saying that his collection, the Met bought his entire photo collection. Laura said, what are the paintings on the wall of the High Society painting? And she's calling out the Archibald Motley cocktails picture that was paired with the James Vanderzee. This cocktails picture, I should mention, is in the collection of the MFA in Boston. And those are monks in the background who are drinking, which was apparently a pretty popular subject in the history of art, like probably around the time of the Dutch Baroque, maybe into the 19th century. So you have white men drinking, maybe as they're not supposed to be, and then black women drinking during Prohibition, maybe as they're not supposed to be, is the kind of correlation there. Thank you for asking that, because that is sort of essential to understanding the painting. But in the interest of time, I kind of went through that. Has anyone heard of rent parties being called skiffles? I have not, but thanks for offering that up, Lee. I'll look into that. Um, Mary says the bust was recently featured on the Antique Roadshow. Ooh, thanks for adding that, Mary. I'm wondering if you're thinking about Augusta Savage or Selma Burke. Um, let's see. Someone asked Mr. Vanderzee, do you just take Black people? His answer was, I take anyone who pays me. Got to respect that, Marvin. An artist needs to get paid, right? Um, let's see here. Anne says, Alan Rohan Kreit's paintings capture life on the streets of Boston's Lower Roxbury and South End neighborhoods. Thanks for adding in that information about Creit. His works, I think, are just so engaging. And please adding in Billy Bragg. Sorry, so I'm sorry that with the messages being added, by feed is sort of updating, and it's hard for me to keep track here. Thanks for adding in the information about Billy Bragg here. And skiffles being rent parties where music played, people brought to the apartment, paid as they entered, so the consumer would get to listen and dance, and the host got their rent paid. Thank you. And Anne says, have the portraits who are part of the W.H. Johnson painting of John Browne been identified? They are supposed to represent the co-conspirators from the raid on Harper's Ferry, the ones that were caught. I believe he had 18 altogether, and there were 16 in the picture, if I'm remembering correctly. I don't know if they are actual portraits of those men. They seem to be specific people, but I'm not sure. That's a good question. Um, Bringing the musically. Thank you for adding all of this. Laura says, really love the Aaron Douglas works. Are they watercolors, collages? Would love to hear you talk about Romare Bearden. Saw that exhibit at the Currier. Laura, thanks for adding that. The Aaron Douglas works that I'm sharing with you tonight, I believe those are all oil paintings. I did have Romare Bearden in this program initially. If anybody saw it at the beginning of the month, I had a whole other section that was like on the next generation of artists. Romare Bearden was really hard to leave out, but the program was just way too long. His works are awesome. Certainly Aaron Douglas's works feel a little bit like collage that way. So I can totally see how like the two artists are sort of connected for you. I wish I could have done some Romare Bearden tonight. Uh, Louise, thank you for your kind words. Oh, Nancy Parker, you're so sweet. And Al says it is still the Black National Anthem. Thank you for sharing that. Lift every voice and sing. It is worth calling up on whatever you use to listen to music and to listen to it. Lee, thanks so much for your kind words. Thank you, everybody, for your kind words. Wow, thank you. I think I've read most of these, and I think I've answered most of these questions. Thank you, everybody. Al says, do we have access to the program that you did earlier this month? Um, Al, you just might. If you really want to see it, let's see, go to my website, which is I Am Culturally Curious, and I can find for you, there's my website, iamculturallycurious.com, and I will try to track down the organizations that I did that for. I might even have a recording of one of them. I think I do. It'll be a little bit longer, and I'd be happy to share a link with you. Rob adds some of the people that that are in the John Browne martyrdom painting were known as the Secret Six, who allegedly helped finance the raid. They did, but could not be proved. Ooh, thanks for adding that, Rob. Um, Everybody, this is like, I love working with these communities because this is such a sophisticated cultural group. Everything that I learned from you every month, I just value and appreciate so much. Next month, we are doing Fierce Females Together, part 3. Some of the artists that we will be introduced to, well, they're remarkable women. And I'm not even going to tease it out yet. Just come back next month, last Thursday of the month. We're going to have a great time. Thank you, everybody, again for being here tonight. Thank you for helping me understand these images better. I will certainly look for better citations for some of the photographs I use. Thank you, guys. Have a great evening, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Take care. Bye-bye.